Okay, well, just while I'm waiting for the slides to appear, I just want to say how delighted I am to be here in Lisbon. It's not my first time here, but every time I come here, I just want to come back again and again and again, because for all kinds of reasons. I suppose one of the reasons is that coming from where I come from, in Ireland, you often find yourself as a kind of smaller country beside a somewhat larger neighbour. So I feel a certain sympathy with the Portuguese, who over the centuries have had a larger neighbour by their side, and how you negotiate sometimes with that neighbour in happier and less happy times. So what I'm going to try and do this evening is to give you an idea of what it is sort of currently preoccupying me in the area of translation studies. And in particular, one of the things that I'm going to talk about is the theme of our week here together, the summer school, is the notion of global translations. And of course, this is something that if you think about the last decade or so, when people have been talking, writing, speculating about translation, that it's very often in terms of how globalizing processes affect translation and how translation feeds into globalizing processes. If we went back 30 or 40 years ago and we were looking at translation, we'd be looking at things like translation in the nation state, how translations shaped the formation of national cultures, national languages, national identities. And to some extent, this has often been the kind of the two polarities that speculation about translation has oscillated between. It's between the nation state on one hand, national identity, national cultures, national languages, and on the other then, the kind of globalizing processes, transnational movements and so on. What I'm going to do this evening is propose, if you like, a kind of a third term, which is not so much the nation, not so much the globe, as I want to bring translation down to earth. I want to think about translation as something that is earthlit. In other words, what I'm going to try and look at or explore is the notion of what would a geocentric translation studies look or feel like, and why is it important, if you like, that we think about the earth in terms of what we do in translation studies. Let me begin with a very tragic event, an event that has deeply marked Portugal in recent weeks, and that was the wildfires that swept through a part of your country. And when people were asking themselves afterwards, why is it that these fires acquired the kind of ferocity, they acquired the intensity, they acquired the deadliness that they did. One of the arguments that's been put forward is that it's partly the result of climate change, that the kind of the period for wildfires was formerly a kind of a 2-month period. Now it's extended to 5 months. You're on a country that is very warm, is very dry, and has these very strong winds coming in from the Atlantic. But there are two further factors. One of them is to do with the nature of the ownership of forests in Portugal. Something like 85% of forests in Portugal are in private ownership, but the average, if you like, size of the forests is, yes, that's one of the slides. But the average size of the piece of forest that's owned by an owner is about 5 hectares. So that means that as the rural population is growing older, more and more bush is developing because these areas are becoming neglected. So this is creating the potential for greater destruction. But of course, there's another aspect to this which bears directly on what I'm going to speak about tonight, which is the presence of monocultures. What you have, if you like, in the forestation system in Portugal is the massive presence of eucalyptus. Eucalyptus, which was brought from Australia to Portugal in the 18th century, and when it really begins to sort of boom as a tree is with the rise of the paper industries in the early to mid part of the 20th century here in Portugal. The problem, of course, with eucalyptus is that it sucks up groundwater. It's quite damaging to animal and plant species, and it is, of course, highly flammable. If you think of the greatest loss of life, 47 people in the recent wildfire, eucalyptus lined the route N236, where the majority of people were burnt to death. So what we find then, in the case of the Portuguese wildfire, is an example of the way in which humans and their environment, that the relationship is beginning to change. Right? And the actual environment that was taken for granted, was exploited, became a site of extraction, is now, in a sense, beginning to fight back. It's beginning to bite back, and it's beginning to bite back hard. So what I would like to suggest then is that just as translation was absolutely crucial, for example, in the development of major faith traditions in China, as the translation accompanied the Enlightenment, as translation accompanied the Reformation, I also think that when we're talking about the greatest challenge that we face this century, not just for everybody here in this room, but for our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, the fact of climate change, what I'm going to argue is that translation is one of the crucial or vital ways in which we're going to think about that altered relationship that was so tragically illustrated by the Portuguese wildfire. And I want to begin my, if you like, thoughts on this by mentioning briefly the work of Rosi Braidotti. Rosi Braidotti argues that as we enter the age of the Anthropocene, right, so this new geological period, where the cumulative effect of human activities is similar to the shift of tectonic plates, is similar to the eruption of volcanoes. In other words, that human activity, or humans have become a geological agent, not just a biological agent. We've always interacted with the environment, but now we're becoming a geological agent, which means that the future of the planet is bound up with human activities, but also the future of human species is bound up with our relationship with the planet. So what Rosi Braidotti argues is that when we think about the notion of subject, about human subjectivity, we've got to think about what she calls transversal subjectivity. In other words, how do we as humans relate to the non-human? How do we relate to those things that are a part of our environment that are not human? What I would argue is that if we're to think about a notion of transversal subjectivity, that one of the things that we've got to think about is translation. Because how do we think about the relationship between the human and the non-human? How do we think about the relationship between things that are incommensurable if we don't think about a translation ethics? If we don't think about how are we going to communicate across difference? How will we deal, how will we negotiate with things that are radically different? And it seems to me that one of the things that epistemically translation has done through the history of its existence, it has grappled with, it has tried to think about this problem of communication across difference. And you'll have to forgive the bit of product placement. You know, any of you who are video game enthusiasts know that very often the camera suddenly zooms in on McDonald's or Lexus number plates. But in this recent book that Peter mentioned, Eco-Translation, Translation and Ecology in the Age of the Anthropocene, I'm trying to look or explore this notion of relatedness, or what it might mean, to think about translation in the age of the Anthropocene in 4 different areas. The area of food and food translation, the area of human mobility, the area of technology, and the area of animal communication. If I could just refer briefly to 2 of these, and then I'm going to talk more extensively this evening about technology. But one of the points that's made in Frans de Waal's recent work, Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are, is that one of the things that we have to think about in terms of the relationship between the human and the non-human is how we negotiate our relationship with other species. This is important for 2 reasons. One is because we're living through what is called the 6th mass extinction. By the end, or by the middle of this century, 50 to 60% of all species on the planet will have been destroyed. The second is that if we take the US alone, 92% of meat is produced in industrial farms. The conditions in which animals are raised, in which they're kept, in which they die, are quite simply disgraceful or shocking by most standards of humanity. And if we think about the history of colonialism, if we think about how people were enslaved, how they were executed, how they were hunted down, how they were caged, it was because they were treated as subhuman, that they were somehow animal, that they were devoid of comprehensible language or intelligible language. And it was very often, not only, but very often, when it was activists, anti-slavery activists and others, who began to translate the different languages into the language of the imperial powers, where people began to realize the cultural, emotional, and cognitive complexity of the world that was inhabited by different peoples in different parts of the world. It was through translation that the positivistic objects of scientific observation and commercial exploitation became the hermeneutic subjects of liberation and emancipation. So if we're thinking about the condition, the animal condition today, do we have to think about how are we going to think about the notion of translation, about communication across species? What would intersemiotic or interspecies communication look like? And in this book, I devote a chapter to looking at what forms that kind of translation might take. Another area is how we relate to the objects around us, not just other animal species, but the inorganic. Elizabeth Povinelli, an anthropologist who works in Colombia, she has coined this notion of what she calls Geo Ontology. And this is from her work with the Aboriginal peoples in northern Australia, where she realized that they didn't make the distinction that we make between animate and inanimate. In other words, the supposedly inanimate or dead world of matter was an extraordinarily animated world for them, that it was full of life and activity and communication. And of course, one of the arguments that she would make is that we have to think about how we reanimate a world that was kind of deadened by the epistemic heritage of the scientific revolution in the 17th century. And this has been, if you like, formulated more explicitly by Timothy Morton, who works in in a philosophical movement called Speculative Realism, where they basically argue that it's time to take objects seriously. It's time to take the objective, those objects which we surround ourselves with much more seriously. I mean, I was in the Gulbenkian this morning looking at the permanent collection. And what's extraordinary, this is a collection that's full of objects. In other words, when we're looking at these different cultures, how do we capture what we see are the most important aspects of those cultures? We capture them through their object histories. So then we've got to think about how do we translate those object histories into a humanly intelligible relationship to the inorganic or objective world. And again, it seems to me that one of the ways in which we do this is to think about translation as a central paradigm for doing this. One of the points that Timothy Morton makes, he has this notion of what he calls the hyper-object. And the hyper-object is an object that is extended in space and time. So, for example, if I drink coffee out of a styrofoam cup, and I don't do the good ecological thing, what the French call le geste citoyen, and put it into a bin, but I throw it on the ground, it takes 350 to 400 years for that styrofoam cup to be recycled. So what's the world going to look like in 350 or 400 years' time? What did the world look like here in Lisbon 350 or 400 years before? So, in other words, it's how, in our relationship with the object world, it has consequences that extend way beyond our time. So we talk about then climate change as a kind of hyper object. What I want to focus on then more specifically this evening, in thinking about this eco-translation, in thinking about the transversal subjectivity in the 21st century, I want to focus on something that is very much part of our lives, which is technology. One of the facts that you regularly told about is that currently there are about 3.5 billion people connected to the internet. There are 6 billion users of mobile phones on the planet, so 90 out of every 100 people has access to a mobile phone. And of course, this is often seen as a glorious example of connectivity, of access to all kinds of information, cultural knowledge, languages, just as people did with the telegraph, just as they did with cinema, just as they did with television. We're being offered a glorious future of utopian connected possibility. Ethan Zuckerman, who works in MIT, who is the head of the media lab there, in his book Rewire, came out in 2013, he says, yes, that is the rhetoric, but what's the reality? The reality, for example, is that if you look at users of news sites, so having access to news of various kinds, he takes the example of Great Britain, France, the United States, and in Italy. In every single one of those countries, 93% of the sites that people look at are in their own language and are rooted in their own country. If you look at Facebook, on average of between 8 and 12 friends of every 100 friends that you have on Facebook are officially outside your country, not always outside your language, but certainly outside your country. But if you begin to analyze those figures deeper, what you find is that they are skewed, they are changed by the fact that you have some people, for example, a young Indian who goes to do graduate studies in New York, and he might have, or she might have 85 friends out of every 100 that are outside the jurisdiction. So if you aggregate the figures, then you get, but in the reality, most people's Facebook friends are very much in their own culture, in their own language, and very often in their own country. So in other words, what Zuckerman argues is that the reality of cyber connectivity is very, very different from the rhetoric. So what he wants to do is he wants to contrast what he calls digital cosmopolitanism. He wants to oppose that to cyber utopianism. Cyber utopianism is the rhetoric of connectivity. Digital cosmopolitanism is how do you actually make that happen? And one of the points that he makes, and of course this is music to our ears as people in translation studies, is a connected world is a polyglot world. As we gain access to thoughts, feelings, and opinions of people around the world, our potential for knowledge and understanding expands. But so does our capacity to misunderstand. As we become more connected, we're able to comprehend a smaller and smaller fraction of the conversations we encounter without help and interpretation. So, in other words, that if we are to make digital connectivity a reality, if we are to really connect to different cultures, different places, different ideas, different thought systems, we need translators. Translators are going to make that a reality. So, you might think, this is very good, this is what we should do. But here's the bad news. The bad news comes from Belgium. And a young, a Europhile all my life. I'm not going to, of course, this could be interpreted in a particular way, but so it's not that. But Pascal Chabot, who is a young Belgian philosopher, in this book, L'Âge des Transitions, he argues that we need to develop what he calls the science of transitology. So what he means by transitology is we need to develop ways, how do we move? The great transition, the title of my paper incidentally, is the transition to a post-carbon society. It's the transition to an ecologically sustainable, resilient society. So in order to do that, we need to develop ways or means of getting there. We need to think about how exactly are we going to do this. And he says that one of the great problems that we have is what he calls the black box problem. The black box problem is basically the way in which we tend to ignore the resource unconscious of our societies. He says, if you read the literature of Greek antiquity, of classical antiquity, there is 2 paragraphs in Aristotle's Politics, but most of Greek literature, ancient Greek literature, is absolutely silent on the main energy source of Greek society, which is slaves. Slaves were the main energy source of Greek civilization. This is why slaves were so valuable, so coveted, so sought after. How many poems, novels, plays do we have that talk about fossil fuels? Okay, everybody says Zola, you know, the Chaminal. We've a bit of Dickens. There's the kind of romantic reaction to the Satanic Mills, but by and large, literatures have been silent about the main source without which civilization as we know it would not exist. So in other words, what Chabot argues is that we have to think about the black box, the things that we want to obscure, the means that allow certain things to happen, which are generally ignored or concealed in our society. And of course, I would argue that's one of the reasons for the invisibility of translation. Translation is often seen as a means to an end, but there's a kind of a taboo about means. We celebrate ends. We celebrate justice. We celebrate democracy. We celebrate connectivity. But how do we achieve democracy? How do we achieve connectivity? So, in other words, that we remain silent about means. Now, of course, the question is, are we as translation practitioners, as translation theorists, are we complicit in the black box? Are we complicit in the resource unconscious? If I look at this, which is on my desk, it's not so fancy, the version I have in Dublin, I'm afraid. Post-austerity, things are not quite so grand anymore. But anyway, the basic... If you look at something like this TAR desktop computer, it typically has a whole range of rare and precious metals. It has aluminium, antimony, it's a dangerous metal. It has arsenic, it has bismuth, it has cadmium, it has chromium, it has gold, iridium, lead, hazardous, platinum, steel, silver, and so on. In other words, there's a host of rare, precious, and toxic metals which are in your computer because of the activity of extractivist industries, which allow your computer to operate. Then what happens when all of a sudden the university decides that it's going to change computers. 90% of computer equipment in the developed world gets recycled in 5 countries on the planet that have the least stringent environmental controls that lead to early deaths, high rates of toxicity, pollution of various places. Then there's the energy that they consume. I have here, or at least somewhere in my pocket, but I switched it off, a mobile phone. So here in Lisbon, because of the EU changes, I'm using this 3G roaming network. Before I couldn't, it was so expensive. But when I use that 3G network, it's using 15 times more energy than an Ethernet connection you sort of plug into the wall. If I move to 4G, which you have in parts of Dublin, it's 23 times greater in terms of energy consumption. If I move to 5G, it's 86 times higher than the, if you like, standard energy consumption. And the problem is, of course, is that the more accessible and more portable and easier it is to use our devices, the more time we spend using them and the more energy we consume. So in other words, the more energy efficient our devices become, in fact, those gains are cancelled out by the fact that we're using them more often. And so also what we tend to use them for. One of the things that's very, very energy intensive is what's called the bit rate of content. So for example, if I take Wikipedia, Wikipedia is, if you took all of Wikipedia in English, it accounts for 9 gigaoctets, which would fit into 2 DVDs. So the entire Wikipedia in the English language could fit into 2 DVDs. This is an absolute tiny fraction of what a standard episode of something like, if any of you are feeling nostalgic and want to look at an episode of Friends, you looked at it online, the entire contents of English Wikipedia would give you the first 15 seconds of that episode of Friends. So if we look at streamed web content, 57% of internet usage in 2012, and it's 69%. It's heading for 69% this year. And then we're going to get the Internet of Things, where everything will be connected through kind of wireless radio devices that will be kind of embedded in all of these objects. And again, energy consumption is going to increase. So in other words, in terms of what we do as translators, in terms of the kinds of practices that we engage in, we are complicit in cultures of extractivism. We are complicit in cultures of growing and rampant energy production or consumption. So what do we do? Well, one of the things you could say is, well, we need to develop a kind of techno-retreat. This is not going to work for 2 reasons. One is, this has been outlined by Timothy Taylor, who is a paleoanthropologist. So he looks at remains, human remains and others, to try and establish how humans lived in what we call prehistoric periods. And one of the things that he argues is that humans are an example of the triumph of the weakest. We have lousy hands. The strength is risible compared to most other comparable primates. Our skin covering is a joke. You can't, in extreme heat or extreme cold, you couldn't survive. Most of us, by the time we reach my age, have back problems. Because the structure of the human body is such that structurally we're badly designed. We have this head that's too big for the body that's carrying it. Our teeth are a joke. They can hardly, and then they fall out. And so he says, so how come this creature, who on the face of it is so inept and comes to dominate the planet. And of course, how it does is through the use of tools. It's through the discovery of tools, discovery of fire, the making of clothes, the development of shelters, the construction of shelters. All of these things mean that it's the kind of techne becomes a defining part of our humanity. In other words, they're trying to conceive of or to think about our humanity without thinking about how tools or techne become a consubstantial part of ourselves is simply not possible. I think it's not possible for another reason, which is to do with the fact that we are now all translation cyborgs. This is the most famous cyborg of all, the protocol droid from Star Wars, who has a modest 6 million forms of communication, C-3PO. And you know the kind of question, if you ever get into a taxi, and taxis ask you what you do, and if you say you're a translator, they always say, how many languages do you speak? And they're always very disappointed when you say 3, 4. I know somebody who speaks 14 languages, you know, this kind of thing. But so C-3PO is very much ahead of the... but what when I talk about translation cyborg is that ever since translation has been practiced, whether it's been through writing, so writing instruments, the use of paper, buildings in which this could take place, the development of the printing press, the printing of translations and so on, the way in which we now, typewriters, then computers, using reference translators' blogs and so on, we're very much caught up, if you like, in a technical infrastructure. And to some extent, one of the things in order to try and capture the nature of climate change is we need a techno-scientific infrastructure. Unless we have techno-scientific knowledge, we simply will not understand the scale, the intensity, and the enormity of the change that we're facing into. So it seems to me then, the question we might ask ourselves is, what would an Earth-based, what would a geocentric translation practice look like in terms of the black box and translation? And what I want to argue is we can look at this from 2 points of view. One is what I'm going to call supply-side ecology, and the second is what I'm going to call demand-side ecology. Let me just begin with the supply side. One of the experiments that's been carried out in parts of India, this is state of Kerala, and there's also an experiment in Catalonia, northern Catalonia, is the development of these low-tech Wi-Fi networks where you basically recycle materials, so it can be dishes, transmitters, and so on, where you develop a network which uses the principle of reduce, reuse, and recycle to create a Wi-Fi network that is as light as possible on the environment and dramatically lowers energy consumption. It also deals with the problem of the digital divide. That there's a huge difference between those people on the planet who have access to high-speed internet and then all the other groups and communities on the planet. The second example is what are called data mules. So this is where you use a public transport network, for example, as a form of of internet. So on the bus that travels from village to village, you have a computer and a storage device, and it has a mobile Wi-Fi node. In each of the villages, you have a storage device. As the bus travels through the village, it picks up what's on the storage device, and then it moves on to the next village. So basically what happens then is the public transport system doubles up as a kind of a wireless network. What you get then is, again, a dramatic drop in energy consumption, but you still get a level of internet connectivity. So what is important, if you like, from our point of view, is these are just two small examples of how we might need to think about, as responsible, as ethically aware translation practitioners and scholars, of how we might need to think about various forms of supply-side ecology in terms of what we do. Another way, of course, is that we design our computers in different ways. We use a modular system, so we know how to make computers easier to repair, easier to recycle. We develop something that is the bane of our existence. So how you get chargers that are compatible, how you get plugs that are compatible, rather than having a whole plethora of these different incompatible things. The other part, of course, of the ecology is this demand-side ecology. In other words, how do we, if you like, develop a way of thinking about translation that is not based on what I would call the culture of translation maximization? And I want to give you, just if I can go back a little here, to one of the big players in the translation industry, Linebridge. Linebridge, typically as a localization provider, when it's advertising what it does, it says that the reason that you should have translation, the reason that you should have localization, is you will sell more goods and services. The more translation you have, the more goods you can sell, the more services you can provide. So it's kind of a virtuous circle of increase. And we can see it here, a service by, this is on the Linebridge website, a service by Common Sense Advisory found that more than half of global consumers only buy products from websites that provide information in their own language. More than half of the countries in the top 10 list for application downloads and revenue are non-English speaking countries from Europe and East Asia. So again, we can say to ourselves, on the one hand, this is very good news for translation because industry is becoming aware of the need for translation. But the other side of that is it's driving a culture of perpetual and endless growth. And this is precisely the problem that we're facing at present. We simply do not have enough planets to sustain the level of anticipated growth in terms of goods and services production. The carrying capacity of the planet is being exceeded. So is translation then, the translation industry, becoming complicit in forms of practice which are ultimately destructive? And I think as well that it's not just the destructive in terms of computers, destructive in terms of energy consumption, but also in terms of what I would call human extractivism. And this is the extraction of translation labour. Let me just, Mackenzie Wark, an Australian theorist in this book, Molecular Red, Theory in the Age of the Anthropocene, he talks a lot about what he calls human extractivism, the way in which more and more labour in our kind of late industrial economies is being extracted for nothing. Think of the number of unpaid internships in publishing and all kinds of areas that are becoming more and more prevalent. So, if we go back to our colleague from MIT, Ethan Zuckerman, he gives as examples of people who make digital cosmopolitanism possible. He gives two examples. One is this Chinese website, Yiyan, which is, the idea is to provide news that's published in English-speaking blogs, newspapers, websites in Chinese. So it began in 2006. There are about 210,000 translators who are translating for this website, but they're all translating for nothing. This is unpaid labour. If we look at the other solution that is proposed by Ethan Zuckerman, this is the work of Luis Vanan, who is a Guatemalan sort of computer expert. And he's developed this notion of what he calls human computation. So human computation is, you know, when you go to a website and you get this little message that comes up to show that you're not a robot. So you type in these words. Well, of course, what you're doing is you're digitally transcribing books. Right? This began in 2000. So since 2008, about 250 books a day are being transcribed. By using this method. In other words, what rate capture does is it brings together all of those words that you type in to digitally transcribe these books. So Luis van Aan is also the co-founder and CEO of Duolingo. A lot of you here probably have Duolingo on your phones, your smartphones. You probably went to lesson 1, lesson 2, lesson 3, got more and more excited, and then you began to ignore the messages saying, your 5 minutes of Portuguese are overdue, or your 5 minutes of Mandarin Chinese. But his idea is that once you arrive at a very advanced level of Duolingo, that sentences from the internet would be sent to you. You would translate these sentences, and then through his various kind of algorithms, these would then be used to translate all of the content on the internet. So you find two things are happening there. One is his ambition is to everything on the internet translated into all of the languages of the world. But what it's based on is, again, this form of extractivism. It's the extraction of unpaid labor across the internet. The question, of course, we might ask ourselves is, to what extent do we need all of the content of the internet to be translated? Do we need an infinite production of goods and services? In other words, do we need, both in terms of our strategies in the area of political economy, but also in the area of translation, to think about the notion of the strategization of translation, or what's sometimes called translation connoisseurship? In other words, do we need to be more selective about what should be or should not be translated? That if translation is a kind of a scarce resource, do we have to think about how would we use that scarce resource in terms of the limited carrying capacity of our planet? And this, if you like, is where it seems to me that we have to think about the demand-side ecology in terms of to what extent, not just what should we translate and how, but is there something about the nature of translation itself that may, in fact, we may need to revisit in terms of an ecological perspective on translation? And this is where I'm sort of coming to towards the end of my lecture here, and it's I wanted to begin with a quote from Donna Haraway, who's done a lot of thinking about the kind of relationship between the animal and the human, between the technical and the human, and so on. And she says at one point, she says, communication science and modern biologies are constructed by a common move, the translation of the world into a problem of coding, a search for a common language in which all resistance to instrumental control disappears, and all heterogeneity can be submitted to disassembly, reassembly, investment, and exchange. I mean, Emily Apter in the translation zone makes a similar kind of point, that one of the things about the fact that images, sound, words, text, that all of these can be reduced to the kind of the universality of the binary code, means that the notion of translatability becomes a kind of a standardizing or homogenizing way of treating all forms of content. And this notion of translatability then, where it becomes problematic, is in terms of what the theorist Boaventura dos Santos has called the notion of epistemicide, right? Which is, what he means by epistemicide is, so it's like suicide or linguicide or biocide, it's the destruction of different forms of knowledge. So for somebody like de Sousa Santos, it's the notion of different ways of looking at medicine, different ways of thinking about the relationship to animals, different ways of thinking about your relationship to the earth, different ways of thinking about the relationship to power, and so on. So what he argues is that there's a certain kind of Western knowledge system that is destroying all these alternative forms of knowledge, right? That all of these alternative forms of knowledge are being translated into a dominant, prestigious form of knowledge. And a colleague here in Lisbon, from Nova, Karen Bennett, has argued that this, in fact, is happening in our universities. That our universities are becoming classic sides of epistemicide in what she calls English as an academic discourse. That's briefly the idea that what has formed the English as it's used as an academic language is the language of the scientific revolution in the 17th century, where the idea is that words, if you like, are to be as transparent as possible, that what's important is how you communicate physical realities, how you describe the physical world. So the puritanical notion of plain speaking is that the way in which you communicate truth is to communicate it as plainly as possible. That language should not sort of get in the way. That, of course, is radically different from the European tradition, the continental European tradition of scholasticism or rhetoric, where, if you like, what we sometimes call constructivism, where language itself becomes one of those things that shapes or alters the world, that it's through language that we come to understand, construct, and manufacture our world. The problem is that one form, what we might call linguistic realism, becomes the only acceptable language to be used in academic discourse. So if you've got global university rankings, where you must publish in a specific language, if you look at the area of medicine, last year 96.3% of all publications in the physical, natural, human and social sciences in the topic of medicine were in English. 96.3% for what is, in global terms, a minority language. I mean, the English is not spoken by the vast majority of people who live on the planet. So, to some extent, there's a sense in which the translatability of various cultures into this kind of the lingua franca of English as an academic discourse is a kind of an epistemicide that is feeding off a particular notion of translatability. And I think one of the ways that we can think about this, and this is to kind of bring us to the conclusion of our thoughts this evening about eco-translation, is to translate or to contrast translation as infrastructure with translation as flow. So this is my home city of Dublin, so this is the typical kind of map that you'll get in the tourist office. So if I wanted to go from Pearse Station, which is one of the railway stations, to St. Stephen's Green, so one of the public parks, you could say, well, I could go down Leinster Street, and I could go down Kildare Street, and I'll take to Stephen's Green, or I could go down Clare Street, Mount Street, then I could go down Fitzwilliam Street, Maggot Street. So there's lots of different ways in which I could get there. So the notion, so we have a map then as what I call the map as infrastructure. The map offers me all kinds of possibilities to get from one place to another. So you could say that's a bit like translation. Translation potentially offers all this access to different languages, different cultures, different ways of thought. But then we look, what do people actually do when they move around a city? They all tend to go the same particular way. They follow the same particular paths because either it's the shortest path, it's the path where it's the least amount of traffic, it's the path where there's the most amount of pedestrian crossings, it's the path where there's the most amount of interesting shops, whatever. So in other words, that the flows are much more reduced than the infrastructure. So I suppose one of the things that I want to suggest is, and this is why I think that translation is such an important discipline for our times, is that when we think about translation as infrastructure, we see all kinds of possibilities. When we think about what actually happens in translation, is that the kinds of the languages that get translated from and into is a very, very small subset of the different languages of the world. But more deeply, it seems to me, we've got to ask ourselves, is there a way in which how we conceive of translation, how we practice translation, the material consequences of the tools we use to effect these translations, are we shutting down the infrastructural possibilities of translation to create, if you like, a very narrow flow? Now, there's huge flows of huge amounts of translated data in particular directions that are not just creating forms of epistemicide, but are also seriously damaging the carrying capacity of our planet. And I think one of the greatest challenges in this respect, and this is where I think translators almost in a kind of an evangelical way, if you think of the tongues of fire descending on the apostles in the Christian account, and they went out and they suddenly effortlessly translated their word into different languages, is the need to think about the very institutions in which we train translators, which are typically universities. It seems to me, if we look at the history of universities, there's the, what you might, if you look at Bologna here, this is the monarchical university, where the desire for the aristocracy, for the king to create a certain amount of distance with the church, so to have a kind of an area of knowledge which could develop to some extent independently of the church. So this is the monarchical university. Then the Humboldt University, 1808, the idea that you had to create citizens who would become the members of the new and emerging nation state. So this Bürgertum, this kind of new class that would emerge to take up office in the new nation state. Then a university that shall remain nameless, the corporate university, it seems that we get in the late 20th century, where the nation state becomes a much weaker entity. We get supranational organizations, we get globalization, and then we get the globalized university, which is students from many different countries. We've got kind of global university rankings, so where the relationship between the nation state becomes more distant than previous. And are those successive forms, have they now reached the end of their sell-by date? In other words, do we need to think about the transitional university? In other words, do we need to think about a new form of organization of knowledge that would prepare us for the great transition to a post-carbon society? And here I'd like to take up something that Professor Berman mentioned yesterday, which is one of the things that climate change is asking us to do, is we can only look, we can only solve, we can only deal with the transition to a post-carbon society if we think about all aspects of our lives. Not just the tools that we use, but how we use them, how we respond to them, how we change our lifestyle, how we change our value system, and so on. And we can only do that if we have all of the physical, natural, social, and human sciences working together. It is only through convergence that we can, if you like, solve or deal with this particular problem. And what we're talking about in convergence is a notion of translation. How do we translate these different disciplines into a kind of language that is going to be ecologically and enabling politically sustainable, economically realistic, and educationally convincing? So I suppose in conclusion, I would think that we've got to ask ourselves whether we can come up with some way of thinking about translation that will not cost the earth. Okay, thank you.